My mother kicked all my friends out of my wedding and turned my day into hell. I had dreamed of my wedding for years. Every detail had been planned with care, from the dress I picked months in advance to the flowers, the music, and the small touches that I imagined would make the day perfect. My friends, the ones who had been with me through everything, were my chosen support system. They had seen me at my lowest, comforted me in heartbreak, and celebrated every achievement. I wanted them there because without them, the day would feel incomplete. I never imagined that the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, the person I trusted the most, would become the source of my worst humiliation. The morning began with excitement. My friends arrived early, as we had all agreed, and we started the day together, laughing as we got ready, sharing stories, and helping each other with hair, makeup, and dresses. Everything felt joyful, light, and hopeful. But I noticed it, the small looks from my mother, the frown that didn't quite fade, the comments she made under her breath. I tried to brush them off, telling myself that maybe I was overreacting, that she was just stressed. Weddings made people tense. It didn't take long before her tension escalated. She started giving instructions in a tone that felt sharp, almost hostile, telling my friends to stand back, saying they were doing everything wrong or making a mess. I attempted to intercede politely, insisting that everything was fine, but her anger didn't relent. Instead, it grew, transforming into a storm that no one could stop. In front of everyone present, the photographer, the makeup artists, even a few early arriving guests, she began shouting accusations at my friends. She claimed they were a bad influence, that they had encouraged me to make wrong choices, and that their presence was inappropriate for a wedding of this kind. I was frozen. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but the words coming from my mother were so sharp, so cruel, that they cut through me. I could see the hurt on my friends' faces, the confusion, the disbelief. Some of them tried to respond, to explain, but she refused to listen. She would not be reasoned with. Within minutes, she had forced every one of them to leave. They cried as they went out the door, and I wanted to follow them, to apologize for her behavior, to make it right somehow, but I was trapped, unable to act, paralyzed by shock and shame. The rest of the day unfolded like a nightmare. Guests arrived, smiles plastered on their faces, but the tension was palpable. The absence of my closest friends created a void that could not be filled. Every smile I tried to give felt forced, hollow, a fragile mask hiding my humiliation. The photographer, the caterers, even distant relatives seemed to notice the unease, glances full of judgment or pity crossing their faces. I felt exposed, every eye a reminder that my wedding, the day I had envisioned as a celebration of love and joy, had become a public spectacle of embarrassment. When it was time for the ceremony, I stood at the altar, looking at the crowd. The emptiness where my friend should have been was almost unbearable. I felt my chest tighten, my heart sinking with every passing second. Each photograph captured moments that were meant to be happy, but the images revealed something else: tension, discomfort, sadness. The colors of the flowers, the elegance of the decorations, even the sunlight streaming through the windows, all of it contrasted painfully with the shadow of shame that hung over me. My mother sat nearby, her expression unreadable, seemingly satisfied. I felt as though I had lost control over my own life, that the person who should have been my ally had taken my joy and crushed it. The reception was no better. Guests whispered, some avoided me, others seemed unsure how to act. I attempted to eat, to smile, to engage, but every bite, every conversation was tainted by the memory of my friends' faces as they had been forced out. The laughter I had hoped to hear was replaced by polite murmurs, and even the music felt wrong. My mind replayed the scene over and over, the anger in my mother's voice, the tears of my friends, the helplessness I felt. It was a cycle that refused to break. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with the aftermath. My relationship with my mother was irreparably damaged. I realized that people I had loved and trusted most could also become the agents of my deepest pain when their need for control or pride overshadowed empathy. My friends, although supportive from a distance, were hurt and hesitant to return to my life fully. I felt the isolation that comes when those who should protect you instead betray you. That wedding, the day I had imagined as perfect, became a turning point in my understanding of family, trust, and personal boundaries. I learned that even those closest to you can cause irreversible harm, and that happiness sometimes depends not on the events you plan, but on the people who choose to either support or destroy you when it matters most. The lessons were painful, but they were real. I emerged from that day forever changed, more cautious, more aware, and painfully aware of the fragility of love and loyalty. In the months following my wedding, I found myself replaying every detail, every expression, every cruel word that had turned what should have been a celebration into a source of shame. I began to see how meticulously my mother had planned each act of control, how she had manipulated the staff, the schedule, and even the guest list to serve her vision of power. What struck me most was not only the pain of my humiliation but the clarity that my mother had deliberately prioritized her own ego over my happiness, over the love and support that had defined my closest friendships. The aftermath was worse than I anticipated. I had expected anger, tears, and perhaps a difficult conversation, but nothing had prepared me for the social isolation that followed. My friends, the ones who had been forced out, were cautious in their attempts to reconnect. Some sent brief messages, apologizing for not being able to celebrate the day with me, while others were silent entirely. The relationships that had once been steadfast and unwavering now seemed fragile, filtered through the lens of that traumatic day. I could not blame them entirely. Anyone would have been shaken by being publicly humiliated and expelled, but the distance felt like an additional wound, a reminder of what had been lost. Even within my extended family, tensions surfaced. Relatives who had been neutral or supportive during previous gatherings now subtly aligned with my mother, whether out of fear, loyalty, or habit. Conversations became cautious, small talk loaded with unspoken judgments. I noticed their glances when I mentioned my friends, the faint smirks when I recounted stories of joy that had once bound us together. The emotional fallout was pervasive, it seeped into every interaction, making me feel isolated in a world that had once seemed safe and familiar. I struggled with feelings of guilt, questioning whether I could have done something differently. Could I have intervened earlier, asserted myself more firmly, or chosen a different approach to my mother's temper? But reflection only deepened the sting of betrayal. It was not my friend's actions, nor my planning, nor my choices that had caused the disaster. It was the deliberate, conscious decisions of someone who was meant to love me unconditionally. The realization settled in like a stone in my chest. Love, when mixed with control and pride, can be destructive, leaving scars far beyond the moment itself. Months turned into a year, and I tried to rebuild the pieces of my life. Therapy helped me navigate the complex emotions, grief for what had been stolen, anger for the humiliation, and confusion over how someone so close could act with such cruelty. Slowly, I began to understand the dynamics at play, not just in my relationship with my mother, but in the patterns of control and dominance that had marked her life. She had always sought to shape the world around her, to assert authority, often at the expense of others' feelings. My wedding had been the pinnacle, the ultimate display of her need to control, and I had been the unwilling protagonist in a story she authored. Reconnecting with my friends was both healing and painful. Some were hesitant, still carrying the memory of being thrown out, yet others extended their forgiveness and support. Rebuilding those relationships required vulnerability, honesty, and time. I apologized for being unable to shield them, for not foreseeing the depth of my mother's interference. They listened, understood, and gradually the bonds were restored, though with the acknowledgement that things would never be quite the same. The wedding had altered our dynamic, introducing an unspoken tension that lingered despite reconciliation. Through the year, I began to examine my own patterns, the ways in which I had allowed my mother's influence to dictate my choices, not just in that day, but throughout my life. I realized that setting boundaries was essential, that asserting my independence was no longer optional but necessary. I had been passive, believing that love and familial loyalty required compliance, and I had learned too late that compliance with cruelty is still harm. The experience forced me to redefine my relationship with her, to separate respect from fear, and to protect the life I wanted for myself. Ultimately, the trauma of that day became a catalyst for transformation. I learned to cherish those who truly supported me, to recognize manipulative behavior even from those closest to me, and to value my own sense of agency above the imposed expectations of others. The wedding, while a day of humiliation, also became a defining moment of resilience. I survived, I rebuilt, and I emerged with a clearer understanding of the fragility and the strength of human relationships. I will never forget the emptiness in that ceremony hall, the absence of laughter and love where it should have been, the faces of my friends fading into the memory of what could have been. But I also learned that trauma does not have to dictate the future. I carried the lessons forward, creating a life where my choices, my joy, and my celebrations are no longer subject to another's control. My mother's actions marked a turning point, a stark revelation of the potential for betrayal within family ties, and yet, from the ashes of that day, I reclaimed a sense of autonomy, dignity, and awareness that I could not have gained any other way. The months after the wedding stretched into a long, quiet reflection. I had survived the public humiliation, but the private pain lingered, gnawing at me during quiet moments when I was alone. I noticed how my mother's shadow seemed to follow me everywhere, a constant reminder of betrayal and control. Even in ordinary moments, checking my email, scrolling through social media, or talking to a friend, the memory of her anger and the forced departure of my friends played like a persistent echo. Every decision I made, every plan I tried to execute, was colored by the knowledge that someone I loved so deeply could inflict such harm with no remorse. I realized that the true damage was not just the humiliation itself but the erosion of trust. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing, difficult to rebuild. I began to understand that some relationships, no matter how intimate, have limits to their reliability. My mother's love was conditional, dictated by her sense of control and pride, and my hope for unconditional support was naive. Accepting this reality was excruciating, but necessary. The first step toward healing was acknowledging that I could no longer expect her to behave with empathy, fairness, or respect. Therapy became a sanctuary. I pored over every detail of that day, tracing the moments when I had tried to intervene, when I had hesitated, when I had hoped she might stop. I explored the complex emotions I felt toward her: love, anger, disappointment, and an almost unamiable grief. The sessions helped me untangle the guilt I carried, guilt that wasn't mine to bear but one I had internalized as a daughter conditioned to obey and please. I learned to validate my feelings, to acknowledge that it was acceptable to mourn the loss of a safe, supportive bond with someone I had once believed was my protector. Rebuilding my friendships was equally delicate. Some friends approached with cautious optimism, their hesitance understandable after the trauma of being expelled from such a personal, intimate event. Others had distanced themselves, leaving silence where laughter had once existed. I reached out, one person at a time, sharing my regret that I had not been able to shield them, expressing gratitude for their previous support, and promising a future in which they would be valued and safe. Slowly, over months of patient effort, some of the bonds returned. They were not exactly as they had been before, marked forever by that day, but they became a source of comfort and resilience. Family gatherings became a test of endurance. Every encounter with my mother was charged with unspoken tension. I noticed subtle patterns in her behavior, tiny digs, condescending comments, manipulations disguised as concern. I learned to navigate these encounters with caution, speaking little and observing more, refusing to allow her control to dictate my responses. I realized that reclaiming my autonomy did not require her approval, nor did it require me to forgive her in the traditional sense. My goal was survival and self-preservation, to define my own life separate from her influence. Over time, I began to reclaim milestones and celebrations on my own terms. Birthdays, holidays, even anniversaries became opportunities to create joy without fear of interference. I invited friends and loved ones who had been my true support system, people who respected boundaries and celebrated my happiness rather than undermining it. Each successful gathering reinforced a sense of agency I had nearly lost, and the contrast with my wedding day was stark. Now, I was in control, and my joy was no longer dictated by another's ego. Despite the healing, the wound left by my mother's actions remained. I carried a wariness that informed new relationships, a heightened awareness of how easily trust could be exploited. But there was also growth, resilience, clarity, and the ability to recognize genuine care versus manipulation. I had learned the painful truth that family ties do not guarantee protection or kindness, and that sometimes, love can coexist with cruelty. Accepting this allowed me to move forward without the expectation of perfection, acknowledging that people, even those closest to us, are flawed, sometimes dangerously so. Reflecting on the wedding now, I see it as a turning point. It was a day marked by public embarrassment and private grief, but it was also the crucible in which I forged self-awareness and strength. I learned that happiness is not found in the perfection of events or the approval of those we expect to love us, but in the presence of people who choose empathy, respect, and loyalty over control and pride. I learned that setting boundaries is not betrayal, it is survival. I learned that reclaiming one's life after trauma is possible, even when the betrayal comes from the person you believed would protect you most. In the end, I survived the chaos of that wedding, and I survived the aftermath. The lessons were harsh, the pain was real, and the scars remained. But through it all, I emerged with a clearer sense of who I am, what I value, and what I will no longer tolerate. I understand now that love is not ownership, support is not conditional, and joy cannot be entrusted to someone who seeks to control it. My mother may have taken my day from me, but she could not take the life I chose to reclaim afterward. In that reclamation, I found strength, autonomy, and a version of happiness that, while quieter and perhaps more cautious, is entirely my own. Time passed, and I began to realize that life does not wait for closure from those who hurt us. My mother never apologized, never acknowledged the chaos she had caused on what should have been the happiest day of my life. There was no reckoning, no justice, and in a strange way, I had to create my own. I had to define my happiness, my relationships, and my boundaries without her input, without her interference, and without her approval. I started planning small, intimate celebrations, inviting only those who had stood by me, friends who had been expelled from my wedding, relatives who had quietly supported me behind the scenes. Each gathering was a small victory, a reclaiming of moments that had been stolen. I began to understand that the essence of family and friendship is not blood or proximity, but loyalty, empathy, and mutual respect. Those who truly cared for me had remained, even if my mother had tried to sever the ties. Healing was not linear. Some days, I would be filled with rage, remembering the humiliation, the shouting, the way my friends had been forced out. Other days, grief would wash over me, the quiet sadness of knowing that my mother, the person I had expected to protect me, was capable of such cruelty. Therapy, journaling, and honest conversations with friends became tools for processing this mixture of anger, disappointment, and lingering sadness. I learned to separate my identity from her judgment, to live for myself and those who genuinely loved me. Eventually, I began to forgive not my mother, not yet, but myself. I forgave myself for the guilt I carried, for the hope that she would act differently, for the belief that her love should have meant protection instead of control. In forgiving myself, I found freedom. I realized that her choices were hers alone, and my happiness would not depend on her understanding, validation, or approval. Years later, my wedding remains a painful memory, but it is also a testament to my resilience. I survived the day my mother tried to turn my life into a spectacle of shame. I survived the estrangement from friends who had been hurt, and I rebuilt those relationships. I survived the slow, painful realization that sometimes the people closest to us can be the ones who inflict the deepest wounds. Now, when I reflect on that day, I see more than humiliation, I see strength, self-awareness, and the beginnings of autonomy. I learned to define joy on my own terms, to protect my boundaries fiercely, and to value the relationships that offer genuine care over those dictated by blood or obligation. I realized that happiness is not given, it is claimed, nurtured, and defended. My mother may have cast a shadow over my wedding day, but she could not darken my life permanently. I rebuilt it piece by piece, with friends who stayed, with boundaries firmly in place, and with the quiet knowledge that I am capable of surviving betrayal, humiliation, and the unpredictable cruelty of those we love. That day, as devastating as it was, became a catalyst for growth. I discovered resilience I didn't know I possessed, and in that discovery, I found the freedom to live authentically, surrounded by people who respect and uplift me, rather than tear me down. In the end, the wedding was not the destruction of my joy but the beginning of reclaiming it. I learned the harsh but necessary lesson that love does not require submission, and that sometimes the most profound victories come from surviving the people who were supposed to protect us the most. I emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to never let anyone dictate my happiness again.